The following episode features a historic article from the Nebraska History magazine. This article may reflect the language and attitudes of its time, and while it offers valuable insight into the past, may contain expressions or viewpoints that are outdated or offensive by today's standards. Any outdated terms do not reflect the current views or perspectives of the Nebraska State Historical Society. Welcome to the Nebraska History Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Goforth. Each episode, we explore articles written and published in Nebraska History magazine. Today's episode brings us the story of the 1st Nebraska Infantry and their role in the battle at Fort Donelson during the Civil War. Learn about their raw determination, facing freezing winds and fierce gunfire as they fought to halt a Confederate victory through the 1964 Nebraska History magazine article, The 1st Nebraska Infantry Regiment and the Battle at Fort Donelson, written by Benjamin Franklin Cooling. During the dark hours of early morning, February 14, 1862, young soldiers of the 1st Nebraska Infantry disembarked from transports at the landing site 3 miles below Fort Donelson in Middle Tennessee. These toughened representatives of an American frontier territory were marching toward a rendezvous with their first major battle in the Civil War. A savage north wind and blizzard sweeping over the valley of the Cumberland River added to their discomfort. The men could not suppress shivers as they drew 40 rounds of ammunition prior to joining the federal force surrounding Fort Donelson. Overnight, young Nebraskans were learning that war was no picnic, but rather a freezing hell on earth. Fort Donelson was not the first assignment for the 1st Nebraska, yet the unit could not style itself as real veterans. 10 companies from throughout the territory had been organized at Omaha in the early summer of 1861. Even a company of Iowa Hawkeyes, spoiling a fight, joined this new unit, which became officially the 1st Nebraska Infantry Regiment. John M. Thayer, formerly a native of Massachusetts, was more recently known to Nebraskans through his service in the territorial legislature, was selected by Governor Alvin Saunders to lead the regiment. On July 30th, 1861, 5 companies departed from Omaha for St. Joseph, Missouri, to the cheers of the gathering of local citizenry. The regiment spent the autumn of 1861 with Major General John C. Fremont's army in Missouri. It was during this period that early favorable impressions were made by the 1st Nebraska. As the regiment marched through St. Louis on the 24th of October, the St. Louis Democrat reported, quote, "In the afternoon, Colonel Thayer's Nebraska 1st, as splendid a set of men and as well equipped, full 1,000 strong, as ever defended a righteous cause, came from Ironton and passed directly through the city, on their way to the seat of war. The Iron Mountain cars, which received them in the morning at Ironton, landed them at night in Jefferson City or farther on. In view of the fact that this was the 1st regiment that had thus passed the city, General Fremont and aide were out to receive them, and musical director Waldauer of the staff, with the magnificent band under his supervision, most eloquently performed the honors of the occasion. It was, taken in all, one of the finest sights ever witnessed in this city. Thousands of citizens thronged the sidewalks and housetops to witness the lengthened train of 39 cars and 4 locomotives as they passed along. Ladies by hundreds waved their handkerchiefs for joy, while men had no fears in giving lusty cheers for the Union." End quote. It seemed, at this point, the rigors of war had not been impressed upon the minds of young boys from Nebraska farmsteads. As autumn gave way to winter in 1861 and 1862, the 1st Nebraska settled into winter quarters at Georgetown, Missouri. It was not the regiment's good fortune to enjoy these quarters long, for in December, the unit was ordered out on constabulary duty. Federal defeats at Wilson Creek and Lexington in August and September had opened much of the state to guerrilla fighting and bushwhacking. By early November, Union forces had yielded virtually all of southwestern Missouri to Confederate forces under Major General Sterling Price. Marching and countermarching occupied Thayer's regiment as it accompanied a Union force under Brigadier General John Pope, determined to restore order and federal control to northern and central portions of the state. On December 18, 1861, the 1st Nebraska participated in a minor skirmish at Shawnee Mound near Milford on the Blackwater River. The result was Union victory and the capture of some 1,300 Confederates. Both officers and men in the ranks of the 1st Nebraska were cheered by the experience, but they could hardly think of themselves as true combat veterans. The regiment returned to Georgetown, battled through an epidemic of typhoid fever, and prepared itself for the hard campaigning which was predicted for the new year of 1862. The Nebraska troops did not have long to wait for the action of a major importance. Late in January of 1862, a relative unknown, Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant, then commanding a garrison at Paducah, Kentucky, convinced Major General Henry Halleck, commander of the Department of Missouri, that a great western defense line of the Confederacy could and should be broken. Forts Henry and Donelson, located just into Tennessee, were attractive weak links in the chain of defense, which ran roughly along Kentucky's east-west axis, from Columbus on the Mississippi to Cumberland Gap in the Allegheny Mountains. Grant was supported by an enthusiastic naval officer, Flag Officer Andrew Foote, and the two together proposed to take a joint Army-Navy expedition up the Twin Rivers and overwhelm the Confederate garrisons. Halleck, sensing pressure for action from the administration in Washington, gave reluctant consent to the scheme. Then, fearing Grant's 15,000 men might be insufficient for the task, he searched desperately for ways to reinforce the expedition. Stripping his department of any available regiments, Halleck ordered forward the zealous but relatively untested 1st Nebraska. The route of march took the regiment from Georgetown to Jefferson City, which it reached on February 7th. News of the fall of Fort Henry the previous day greeted the Nebraskans as they boarded a train for St. Louis. On February 9, 1862, the regiment embarked on a steamer White Cloud and was sent to join Grant's army, regrouping at Fort Henry before moving overland to besiege Fort Donelson. At 4:30 p.m. on February 11th, shortly before Grant himself left to join his troops marching over soggy roads toward the Cumberland, 5 gunboats and 12 transports with 8 fresh regiments aboard, among them the 1st Nebraska, arrived at Fort Henry. Grant immediately ordered these boats to transfer their operations to the Cumberland. They were directed to land below Fort Donelson in order to reinforce the 2 divisions Grant was taking overland. The transports, with the gunboat Cardinale in escort, returned down the Tennessee River, thence up the Ohio River to Smithland, Kentucky. Entering the Cumberland at this point, the convoy encountered floodwaters and numerous floating snags. Heavy February rains had sent the river boiling over its banks, and trees and debris clogged the channel. The transports were jammed with troops and equipment, and little headway could be made against the rushing current. Meanwhile, Grant's field army was having its own share of troubles with Fort Donelson and its stubborn defenders. Federal forces found that the easy conquest of Fort Henry would not be repeated at Fort Donelson. The fort and nearby town of Dover were located on the south bank at a curve made by the river, 75 miles downriver from Nashville. The surrounding country was punctuated by creeks, ravines, and heavy woods. Due to the flood conditions, much of the land lay underwater, hardly ideal conditions for land movement of military forces. Confederate works in the area consisted of a long line of rifle pits, protected by abatis, extending in a huge semicircle with northern and southern flanks anchored on the river. Enclosed within these outer defenses were the town of Dover, the fort, and its water batteries. These batteries themselves were situated 100 feet above water level in order to prevent gunboats from passing upstream to Nashville. Inside sandbagged embrasures were 12 heavy guns mounted on seacoast carriages. In addition, some 15 to 20,000 battle-hungry Confederates manned the overall defense system. A majority of these men were Tennesseans, eager to defend their home state. The gray-clad defenders were hampered, however, by a weak command system, divided between Brigadier Generals John B. Floyd, Gideon Pillow, and Simon Bolivar Buckner, with Floyd in nominal charge. Grant invested Fort Donelson on February 12th and 13th, 1862, with his force of 15,000 men. Strangely, the Confederates offered little opposition as Union division commanders John B. McClernand and Charles F. Smith moved into position. Local probing assaults by federal infantry and artillery on the 13th did provide Grant with ample evidence that the defenses were strong. Nevertheless, the numerically superior defenders made no effort to escape the ever-tightening trap. Meanwhile, Grant anxiously awaited arrival of the reinforcements aboard the transports, which were slowly steaming up the Cumberland. As dusk settled over the opposing armies, the unreasonably mild weather of early February turned bitterly cold. Fires could not be made by either army, and many Federals, having thrown away overcoats and blankets on the march over from Fort Henry, suffered and cursed the freezing weather. That night, rain, sleet, and 3 inches of snow covered the dead, the dying, and the cheerless living. It was during such a night that the 1st Nebraska was initiated to the Fort Donelson scene. Disembarking in the black darkness of early morning, the reinforcements, among them the Nebraska Regiment, were soon trudging along the frozen, rutted road leading toward Mrs. Crisp's cabin, Grant's field headquarters. As dawn broke on February 14th of 1862, the thermometer stood at 10 degrees above zero. Grant organized the 8 new regiments into a 3rd Division, commanded by Brigadier General Lew Wallace. The 1st Brigade, under plucky Colonel Charles Cruft, was a reasonably veteran outfit, having served as a unit until Major General Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio since December of 1861. A 2nd Brigade, officially styled the 3rd Brigade for some unknown reason, was different. Assigned to the leadership of Colonel John Thayer of the 1st Nebraska, the regiments of this brigade, 1st Nebraska, 58th, 68th, and 76th Ohio, were agonizingly innocent of training and experience. Determination and toughness were present, however, and these, in part, promised compensation for their military deficiencies. In the absence of Thayer, Lieutenant Colonel William D. McCord commanded the Nebraska troops. Wallace was unable to assemble his division until 2:30 p.m. He was unaware of the inexperience in his command, but wished to move into position as assigned by Grant and rapidly as possible. The afternoon wore on as the division moved forward along unfamiliar country lanes, guided solely by Captain John A. Rawlings, Grant's assistant adjutant general. Sound of naval gunfire in the distance accompanied the column as it pushed on through woods and occasional clearings. The snowfall increased and darkness was closing in as Rawlins at last asked Wallace to halt his men. Rawlins briefly explained that the 3rd Division was in the center position with Confederate works, screened by dense woods, less than 600 yards in front. The division line would be formed along the axis of the Ridge Road as it dipped from high ground into the Indian Creek Valley. The right wing of Smith's division lay 1/4 mile to the left through a wall of trees and falling snow. McClernand's division was equally distant from Wallace through the dusk and gloom to the right. As Rawlins rode off, Wallace ruefully reflected that his division was not solidly anchored in position, but was one of 3 isolated segments of the army. He was further stung by the reminder that his cavalry, the only possible link with Smith and McClernand, had been left back at Fort Henry. That night brought little joy to the 1st Nebraska and other commands in the division. The march to the front had left them exhausted, hungry, wet, and cold. Fires were once again prohibited, and ground covered with snow and water provided little appeal as resting space. Some of the men, too tired to care, forced down raw bacon with hardtack and dropped off to restless sleep. Officers quietly moved among their men, trying to bolster spirits and find out whether their commands could stand a fight if a battle came in the morning. Equally disheartening that night was the news which trickled through the units telling of the disastrous defeat suffered by the Federal gunboats that afternoon. Flag Officer Foote, in attempting to repeat his success at Fort Henry, had maneuvered his gunboats to within 400 yards of the Confederate water batteries. These batteries so badly mauled the flotilla that it had to retire northward for repairs. By nightfall of February 14th, the Confederates were quite undaunted. The Federal naval force could no longer be considered a factor in the battle, and Grant's siege line was dangerously strung out, inviting counterattack. Within Confederate lines, Generals Floyd, Pillow, and Buckner had no intention of being starved into surrender. On the morning of February 14th, a council of war voted unanimously to attack McClernand's overextended division and open the escape route via the Charlotte Road to Nashville. Formation for such an attack stalled into the late afternoon, and the Confederate command finally postponed the assault until the following morning. As the first call of Union bugles sounded on the cold morning air of February 15th, blue-clad soldiers were awakened by the crash of gunfire on the extreme right. The Confederate battle line surged forth from jagged ravines and scrubby underbrush, bent low with fallen snow. 7,000 Confederates, led by Pillow, slashed at McClernand's right flank, and to a fierce 2-hour fight, it began to drive back toward the Union center. As the situation slowly deteriorated, Wallace and Smith remained unaware of the fighting raging on the far right. Lack of cavalry and the dense forest contributed to the communication breakdown. Finally, at 8 a.m., Wallace received a request for aid from McClernand. After an hour later, Buckner threw an additional 3,000 men against the 1st Division, and McClernand was in serious trouble. Grant's orders forbade Wallace from leaving his position and taking independent action, so the division commander simply forwarded McClernand's request on to Army headquarters. Unfortunately, that morning, Grant was absent, visiting the wounded foot on his gunboat. At 8:30 a.m., a second plea reached Wallace, followed in rapid succession by word from Army headquarters that Grant was absent, and thus the decision was left entirely up to Wallace. Disregarding Grant's orders, Wallace immediately sent Cruft's brigade to McClernand. By the time Cruft maneuvered into action between 9 and 10 o'clock, the 1st Division line had begun to disintegrate, and the fragments were fleeing along the Winds Ferry Road, which led toward Fort Henry, 12 miles away. Meanwhile, the 1st Nebraska and Thayer's brigade remained in position. Shortly before 10 o'clock, Federal officers of the brigade caught sight of the first tangible evidence of the battle, stragglers and demoralized wrecks of units in McClernand's command. An aide sent to find the cause returned to report that Winds Ferry Road was jammed with horsemen and wagons, and the whole mass was moving toward the remainder of Wallace's division. Confusion mounted, and discouragement threatened to spread to Wallace's men. Just then, several regiments, the 20th Ohio, 46th, 56th, and 58th Illinois, pushed through fugitives who, by this time, blocked the road leading to Mrs. Crisp's cabin. Wallace directed these units to join Thayer. Wallace then made up his mind to move Thayer's oversized 3rd Brigade forward to the right in the direction of the Winds Ferry Road. The division commander detached the 68th Ohio as Thayer's brigade crossed the valley of Indian Creek and ascended the opposite slope. The Buckeyes were ordered to form a roadblock on the Pinnery Road, which ran through the valley into the Confederate lines. Moving swiftly onto the Winds Ferry Road, Thayer's men noticed disorganized elements of McClernand's division everywhere. They stood around in little groups, waiting for ammunition and orders to return to the fight. As the hour of crisis arrived, Wallace observed that the road dipped slightly, forming a strong defensive position. On either side of Winds Ferry Road, undergrowth and blackjack thickets channeled any attacking column onto the road itself. Hastening back to meet Thayer's oncoming brigade, Wallace shouted, quote, "File the 1st Nebraska to the right, the next regiments to the left. The 2 will support the battery between them here. Make a second line of your 4 regiments and hold it in reserve behind the 1st Nebraska," end quote. Leading the van, the Nebraskans double-timed into position, anchoring their left flank on the road. Lieutenant Colonel McCord fused his right flank with the 58th Illinois in line to the right. First Lieutenant Peter Wood's section of Battery A, 1st Illinois Artillery, the Chicago Battery, rolled into position, flipping over a gun in haste. The battery was joined astride the road by guns of Battery B, 1st Illinois Artillery, Captain Ezra Taylor in command. A detached contingent of the 32nd Illinois took position on the left side of the road. The 58th Ohio was deployed on the slope of the ridge beyond the Illinois detachment. At that point, tangled underbrush of Buffalo Hollow hid the line from Confederate entrenchments several hundred yards away. Lying on the ground some 50 yards behind the 1st Nebraska was the 76th Ohio. In reserve on the Winds Ferry Road to the rear were the 46th and 57th Illinois. These reserves were prepared to respond to any emergency when the fighting developed. Wallace and Thayer had hardly formed their troops before the Confederate attack came whirring up the road. When the Federals first sighted the Butternuts, they were moving along the road and on either side through the brush. Alignment was rendered impossible, and Colonel John C. Brown's Tennessee Brigade of Buckner's division was forced to bunch up and advance directly forward on the road itself. Their attack was supported by one piece of artillery, served by Graves' Kentucky Battery, 100 yards to the rear. Woods and Taylor's artillerists immediately began to hammer the advancing Butternuts with canister and shell. A correspondent for the Chicago Times reported, quote, "As the rebels, supposing we were on the retreat, came yelling out of their works onto the road, the Chicago boys, batteries A and B, poured a hailstorm of shell and canister into them, slaughtering dozens," end quote. Wallace shouted instructions for Thayer to have his infantry open fire. The brigade commander relayed the word to Lieutenant Colonel McCord of 1st Nebraska. Under orders previously given, the left wing of the Nebraska regiment started to blaze away. Seconds later, the right side of the regiment commenced to rip the attacking Confederates with musketry. Wallace, quote, "saw the Nebraskans' muskets rise and fall as if on parade ground. A volley and smoke, and after that constant fire at will as fast as skilled men could load," end quote. The Confederates returned the fire warmly, but made little effort to storm portions of Thayer's line other than that held by the 1st Nebraska and the artillery. 25 years later, Wallace, who remembered the ensuing scene vividly, wrote, quote, "The Confederates struggled hard to perfect their deployments. The woods rang with musketry and artillery. The brush on the slope of the hill was mowed away with bullets. A great cloud arose and shut out the woods and the narrow valley below," end quote. Brown's attack quickly bogged down in the face of the heavy resistance offered by the 1st Nebraska and the Illinois batteries. The Confederates were also raw troops, and they had been marching and fighting since dawn. Faced with superior numbers and devastating firepower, such crack units as the 3rd Tennessee Infantry were thrown into confusion and fell back several hundred yards. The 18th and 22nd Tennessee regiments were likewise repulsed by Wallace's roadblock. Impetus of the Confederate breakthrough vanished in a confusion among the Confederate generals at this point yielded the initiative in the battle. As Brown's brigade regrouped for further assaults on Federal position, Pillow directed all Confederate forces back to the entrenchments. Buckner violently protested, but Floyd upheld Pillow's rash move. Reluctantly, the gray-clad soldiers withdrew, abandoning the field to the Federals. Thayer's brigade made no attempt to counterattack the retiring Confederates. Thayer, with a note of discontent, recorded in his official report, quote, "Nothing but the thick underbrush prevented a charge with the bayonet," end quote. About 3 p.m., Grant arrived on the battlefield and immediately ordered restoration of Union battle lines on the right. At the same time, Smith's division was directed to assault Confederate rifle pits in the Eddyville Road sector on the far left. The 1st Nebraska remained in its defensive position astride the Winds Ferry Road during these actions. At daylight on February 16th, Thayer moved his brigade forward along the road and joined the refused Federal right wing. Before the Federals could begin any further attacks on the Confederate entrenchments, white flags appeared above the earthworks. Later that morning, Buckner and Grant met to discuss surrender terms at the Dover Tavern. 14,000 Confederates were thus surrendered and transported northward to prison camps. It was the first of 3 such significant surrenders for Ulysses S. Grant during the war. The meaning of Fort Donelson cannot be measured by heavy casualties. Of the 27,000 Federals finally brought together before the fort, 2,600 were killed or wounded, as opposed to an estimated 2,000 of the 21,000 Confederates in the battle. Losses sustained by the 1st Nebraska only amounted to 10 men. Fort Donelson was instead a victory of strategic importance for a winning combination of land and naval power working in unison, was forged on the Twin Rivers in early of 1862. The first decisive victory for forces of the Union and elimination of one Confederate army in the field resulted from the battle. Flagging spirits and letdown in the Union war effort at home after the initial patriotic race to the colors in 1861 evaporated in a new spurt of dedication to the preservation of the Union. The people of the North had a new general to watch and applaud as his star rose on the Union horizon. Ulysses Simpson Grant, whose sobriquet, unconditional surrender, seemed to fit so well the modest, retiring, yet resolute man who had seized the initiative. Despite temporary setbacks, he was never to lose it. Grant's victory was due in part to the dogged persistence of the man in the ranks. Men of the 1st Nebraska could claim their share of the credit for success. Their stubborn defense astride the Winds Ferry Road had stemmed the tide of retreat and saved Grant's army from catastrophe. Crushing volleys from muskets of the regiment and the artillery fire of the Illinois batteries had blunted the spearhead of the desperate Confederate assault. Arriving back on the field at a fortuitous moment, Grant was able to seize the initiative from a dazed Confederate command and sweep to victory. It was with pardonable understatement that Colonel John Thayer recorded in his report, quote, "The Nebraska regiment, being the only one engaged at this time, I was with it during the action, and I'm pleased to be able to say that every officer and soldier behaved very gallantly throughout. I cannot omit to speak in high terms of the soldierly bearing and efficient conduct of Lieutenant McCord and Major Livingston during the engagement," end quote. Lew Wallace was perhaps more pleased with the regiment's success. He reported, quote, "The 1st Nebraska met the storm, no man flinching, and their fire was terrible. To say they did well is not enough. Their conduct was splendid. They alone repelled the charge," end quote. Coming from superior officers who witnessed their conduct, these words were dramatic proof that the Nebraskans had met their test of major battle. They had proven themselves worthy of being called veterans. Tranquility now reigns along the Cumberland. The men in blue and gray are ghosts to us now. Fort Donelson remains, preserved since 1928 as a national military park. For years, however, the park has languished behind more popular battlefield parks, especially those in the East. No monuments have been raised to the Union soldiers who fought there. Even today, the circuit of federal battle lines and the scene of the Nebraskans' decisive stand lie undeveloped, inviting commercial exploitation beyond the scope of park boundaries. A tribute more fitting would seem to be in order for men of the 1st Nebraska and the other regiments who gave to the Union the key to the Western Gateway, Fort Donelson. Thank you for listening to the Nebraska History Podcast. To learn more about Nebraska History Magazine, to listen to more podcasts, or support our podcast by becoming a member of the Nebraska State Historical Society, just go to history.nebraska.gov/podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast platform and get notified when we release a new episode every other week. Until next time, I'm Chris Goforth.